I never thought a strip of emerald grass, something so ordinary and yet profoundly therapeutic, would become the catalyst for a neighborhood uprising that would expose corruption, reshape policy, and ultimately redefine what community means. But fate has a curious way of turning small grievances into seismic battles. And mine began on a cool Saturday morning when I stood barefoot on the dew-kissed lawn of my home in Sunnyvale Estates, breathing in the scent of freshly cut turf and hoping for once that life might grant me a quiet chapter after the storm of grief. Because as a high-security systems engineer who had spent years fortifying skyscrapers and protecting people from invisible threats, I believed I could build peace by retreating from turmoil, buying a house in a quiet suburb after a bitter divorce and my father's sudden death, trying to heal through the rhythm of gardening, pruning, and watering, which reminded me of summers spent by his side as he taught me life, law, and the belief that justice matters even when no one is watching. My name is Sean O'Connor, and the lawn was never just grass to me. It was a sanctuary, a coping mechanism, a living tribute to a man who carried integrity like armor, and I poured myself into it, planting, leveling, fertilizing, until the chaos of my personal life softened and a fragile sense of order returned. But tranquility is fragile, and mine shattered the moment Era Torres, the imperious and self-absorbed president of the Sunnyvale Estates HOA, decided that sidewalks were beneath her, and, instead, she marched daily across my lawn as though it were a public throughway, her heels sinking into the soil, her perfume trailing arrogance, her posture radiating entitlement. And when I confronted her politely, hoping reason might work, she responded not with apology, but with a dismissive smirk, claiming she had executive discretion over landscaping and pedestrian access. A phrase so absurd it left me speechless in the moment, but fueled a quiet rage inside me. Within a week, symbolic warnings escalated into bureaucratic warfare. Letters citing alleged violation for grass height, mailbox placement, and even the color of my mulch, all signed by Era, who clearly wielded the HOA handbook not as a guideline, but a cudgel, ripping down my modest, "Please keep off the grass" signs, rewriting citations mid-week, and wielding fines like weapons. And even though I initially ignored her, chalking it up to petty authoritarianism, I soon realized I was facing more than an irritating neighbor. I was confronting someone who had manipulated her way into power and now used that authority to control, intimidate, and enrich herself. Attempts at compromise revealed how deeply her claws had embedded themselves in the community. A simple decorative fence proposal was denied on aesthetic grounds. Rose bushes, my father's favorite, were deemed non-approved flora. And when I noticed the landscaping company servicing the neighborhood bore the name Torres & Sons Lawn Works, I followed the thread and discovered it was owned by Sam Torres, her brother, who enjoyed a lucrative exclusive contract approved without public vote, charging exorbitant rates for subpar work, a kickback scheme masked as necessity, and suddenly the puzzle pieces aligned. Era wasn't just vain. She was corrupt. Residents whispered, but never opposed her, terrified of retribution in the form of fines or legal letters. And slowly, I saw how she had weaponized fear to build her miniature kingdom, exploiting the HOA charter not to unify, but to dominate, extorting compliance through intimidation disguised as policy enforcement. And as I watched her proclaim herself judge, jury, and executioner over shrubs and sidewalks, something inside me awakened, not just irritation or pride, but the memory of my father's voice reminding me that law without morality becomes tyranny, and that silence in the face of bullying is complicity. The day I discovered invoices reflecting inflated landscaping costs and unauthorized maintenance surcharges, I understood the scale of her manipulation. And at that moment, the man who bought a home to escape conflict became someone else, a strategist, an engineer who knew how to identify vulnerabilities, exploit loopholes, and construct defenses. And I vowed that if Era Torres wanted to escalate this into a battle, I would not back down. I would fight with precision, legality, and patience, transforming my lawn from a sanctuary into a symbol, not of grass, but of resistance to corruption masquerading as authority. Act 1 closed not with defeat, but with resolve as I stood on my porch, looking at the lawn she trampled, knowing that a war was coming, a war not chosen but necessary, and I promised myself one thing. I would not simply survive. I would expose her, dismantle her power, and ensure that no one else in this community lived in fear of a woman drunk on authority. As an engineer trained to design systems that deter intrusion while respecting legal boundaries, I turned my expertise toward crafting a response that was elegant, lawful, and humiliating, a trap that exploited loopholes within the HOA's own rules. And so, I created a deterrent composed of rubberized spikes, barely an inch tall, incapable of causing lasting harm, yet guaranteed to deliver discomfort, paired with a motion sensor-activated sprinkler array calibrated to drench anyone crossing the perimeter, integrated with high-resolution cameras and an automated audio alert broadcasting property rights statutes. And because I studied the HOA bylaws meticulously, my contraption fit perfectly within the permitted scope of non-permanent protective landscaping accessories, making it immune to ERA's punitive clauses. At precisely 8:37 the next morning, the universe aligned for a moment of poetic justice as ERA, strutting across my lawn with the arrogance of a self-proclaimed monarch returning to her throne, triggered the spikes, stumbled, shrieked, and was immediately blasted by ice-cold water, mascara streaking, suit soaked, her fury captured in glorious high definition. And although I spoke to her with a veneer of civility, explaining the legality of my setup, she knew she had been outmaneuvered, and humiliation curdled into rage, something primal and vindictive, because in her mind, control was absolute, and my defiance was treason. She retaliated with escalating severity, tampering with neighborhood utility access to cut my water pressure, issuing violation notices for fabricated infractions, manipulating city planning contacts to stall my renovation permits, and even attempting to push emergency amendments banning my device retroactively, weaponizing bureaucracy to compensate for her bruised ego, while residents watched in silence, afraid, intimidated, or resigned, believing the system was unbreakable. But I refused to concede. Instead, I shifted from defense to offense. I approached neighbors long oppressed by her tactics. Lizzie, who was fined for driveway, chalk her grandchildren drew. Harriet, punished for holiday decorations. Gloria, the former HOA treasurer who resigned after discovering accounting anomalies. And together, they shared documents, testimonies, and outrage that had simmered for years. I enlisted Daniel Wright, a level-headed attorney who specialized in HOA law, Sophia Garcia, a journalist itching for stories of suburban corruption, and Detective Bradshaw, a seasoned investigator whose suspicions of collusion between city planning officials and private contractors aligned with my findings. And together we unearthed irregularities, inflated maintenance invoices, falsified budgets, and unexplained fund transfers pointing toward embezzlement, bid rigging, and abuse of authority. Then came my masterstroke. Using my knowledge of psychological manipulation and surveillance, I drafted fake infrastructure project documents hinting at a lucrative landscaping expansion, knowing the greed of ERA and Sam would compel them to seize the documents illegally. And when they trespassed, under cover of night, thinking themselves clever, my security system captured everything, their voices conspiring, their hands rifling through my things, their intentions laid bare on video and audio, creating a chain of evidence that tied them not only to HOA misconduct, but criminal acts including trespassing, attempted theft, and conspiracy. The moment I secured that footage, I knew the tide had turned. The tyrant had trapped herself, undone by her own arrogance. And Act 2 closed with the realization that this was no longer a petty lawn dispute. It was a systemic exposure of corruption, fear, and greed that infected an entire community, and the time for unveiling had come. The next HOA meeting was unlike any the neighborhood had ever seen. Packed with residents, journalists, legal counsel, and city officials, the room humming with anticipation, resentment, and long-suppressed frustration. And when my turn came to speak, I did not raise my voice. I simply presented the evidence, videos, audio recordings, financial documents, and witness statements, layer by layer, building a case so airtight that silence replaced scoffing, and whispers of disbelief turned into gasps of betrayal as residents realized how deeply they had been manipulated. Era attempted denial, dismissal, and blame shifting, but allies abandoned her. Board members distanced themselves, and city officials declared they could no longer ignore the allegations. Even Sam, sensing the inevitable, fell silent, leaving her exposed as a despot without subjects, a tyrant without legitimacy. Then Detective Bradshaw stepped forward and read the arrest warrant aloud. Charges including trespassing, document theft, embezzlement, bid rigging, and conspiracy. And as handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the room erupted not in laughter or applause, but a collective exhale, a symbolic cleansing of fear, because the community had finally stood up to the bully who hid behind bylaws, and her downfall was not revenge. It was accountability. Legal consequences followed. Era Torres received probation and was ordered to pay $350,000 restitution. Sam Torres faced charges tied to bid manipulation and contracting fraud. The HOA board resigned. New leadership was elected. Financial transparency protocols were implemented, and city officials collaborated on legislation informally called the HOA Protection Act, designed to prevent abuse of authority and ensure democratic accountability within community governance. But the greatest transformation was cultural, not legal. Residents who once avoided eye contact now greeted one another. Potlucks replaced tense silence. My lawn became a gathering space for barbecues, celebrations, children's games, and fear dissolved into camaraderie as the neighborhood renamed itself Sunnyvale Commons, symbolizing the return of collective ownership and mutual respect rather than authoritarian control. And in the aftermath of conflict, I found unexpected companionship with Lizzie, someone who understood loneliness and resilience. And together we nurtured not just the lawn, but a budding relationship rooted in trust and shared purpose, proving that personal healing can coincide with social reform. One evening, months after the arrest, I stood on my porch, watching kids race across the same lawn once guarded by spikes. And I felt closure, not because I won, but because justice prevailed, because fear gave way to courage, and because a community discovered it had power all along, waiting only for someone to challenge the voice that claimed to speak for everyone while serving only itself. I learned that tyranny doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a blazer, carries a clipboard, and hides behind bylaws. And I learned that resistance is not always violent. Sometimes it is measured, strategic, patient, and grounded in love for what is right. But now I pose a question. When authority transforms into oppression, when rules are twisted to justify exploitation, is defiance not only allowable, but morally required? And do we, as witnesses, bear responsibility to challenge injustice, even when it threatens our comfort? Where does order end and tyranny begin? And who decides?